if I had it to do over again, I would have been this, I would have been that. But I had to support myself, I had to do this, I had to do that. I don't have that complaint. I mean, if I could do it over, I'd do it better. But who can't say that? And if there are other lives, I'd like to be a cellist in one of them. And I never had a chance to pick one up in this. But in a fundamental sense, I've spent my entire adult life doing the things I wanted to do, what I cared about. You know, it was a response, not a theory in conventional terms, it was a response to the daily experience of life and life with others. You know, you simply do what needs to be done. And in that context, you look back and you say, I have nothing to regret. I'm so grateful for, you know, for the opportunity to have spent 35 years doing what I wanted to do, what was most important to me at the time. So I think that's that's the lesson for me, you know, and what we want to teach the kids. You can make a choice. That choice should come from that dignity, that energy which no one can take from you, and it should be grounded in that experience, that knowledge that you live with others in an unbreakable relationship. I think probably the most important feature of the life I've had, say in contrast to many others of my generation or even my convictions, is that I was blessed throughout this adult life with many relationships with older people who shared the same values but had been living by them for twice as long as I've been alive. I have elders. I've known my elders since that day at 18 that I landed on the doorstep of my friends Wally and Juanita Nelson in Philadelphia, and a week later went with them to the Catholic Worker Farm for a peacemaker orientation program in nonviolence. But I found in 2 weeks a group of people, most of them twice my age, who had similar convictions, but had said to themselves, this is what we believe, how should we live? And then had proceeded, whatever the cost, to craft with a good bit of creativity and with an ongoing reliance on one another, because they had little else to rely on. Most of them had neither fame, fortune, nor power, but they had crafted a life that reflected those values. And what life with them, or what their example did for me, is to say it's possible, you can do it, and the rewards are maybe unpredictable, but great.
So the best kind of community development also emphasizes personal development in that sense too.
It certainly requires personal commitment, and it requires a willingness to try to shape one's own life in response to the relationships that define that community. To be a part of the community, not, an advisor to it, but to be a part of it. And I think that is always the question.
What makes it so hard for people to do that? Why do there seem to be so few?
Well, as I said, I think that in interesting and ironic ways, the apparent privileges of affluence and mobility that have come into our society in really just very recent years, in our lifetimes even, like I said, on the one hand, they're privileges. On the other hand, they've helped us create and perpetuate the illusion that we're not dependent on one another in a way that people always were and knew that they were. And as we began to believe that we didn't have to stay and we didn't have to share what we had, that we could succeed on our own in this economy and we could move wherever its opportunities invited us, the basic relationships began to break down. And with that comes a sense of aloneness that in good times may not be troubling. In good times it's the ability to, to come and go and have and do. But when tough times come, who do we turn to? So in some ways, I think we're much less prepared today as a community than we were 50 years ago to confront the challenges that that have been part of human experience since the beginning of time. So I don't know really the answer to the question, except that I think we have to know our fundamental dependence on one another, our reliance on one another, and we have to know it through experience. And if we don't know it, then there's little incentive to accept the personal responsibility that is required of anyone. I remember having an interesting time in South Dakota some years ago as our network of loan funds was emerging, and some friends who were Lakota Sioux had come to one of our National Loan Fund Association conferences. They hadn't previously been involved in our little movement. We didn't call it an industry then, but they heard about it, and they knew that they had problems with access to capital. The banks wouldn't lend to tribal members, so they heard about our simple fledgling experiments and decided to come to this conference and see who we were and what we were doing and whether it had anything to offer to them in their circumstances. And then shortly thereafter, they asked me if I would come out for a little retreat that they were organizing, bringing together representatives of different factions of their community to talk about creating some kind of a lending vehicle or a finance program for community development on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And it was very interesting to listen to the different participants. When I got there, I was disappointed because I'd been looking forward to spending some time on the reservation, and I hadn't been there 2 hours in the school building before my friend who had invited me came and said, "Well, put your bag in the car, we're on our way." And I said, "On our way where?" He said, "Well, we're going to a motel 2 hours from here." I said, "What?" He said, "There's a reason for this, I'll tell you later." So we go to this motel distant from the reservation, and he said, "You're on your own for a few hours. I want you to sit and listen, but then I'm going to come to you tonight and help you understand what you're hearing." So the first night was just introductions as people went around the room and introduced themselves and just kind of set the stage for a process or several days of discussion. And then my friend came to me and he said, "Now, you've heard each of these people introduce themselves. Let me tell you who they are and what's going on here." He said, "This one is from a traditionalist faction that doesn't recognize the tribal government, but this one is an agent of tribal government. This one speaks only Lakota. This one speaks Lakota and English. This one speaks only English. This one is a full-blood, and this one is a half-blood. This one lives on the reservation, and this one lives off. And none of us can remember when this many conflicting interests have been in the same room together at the same time. So we thought it would be safer to come to neutral ground." Well, anyway, it was interesting to know how many different perspectives and life experiences were represented in this community that, despite its traditional character, was now going through the process of adapting to modern life and the modern economics, and was suffering terribly in that process. Unemployment, 85%, all the indicators of social dysfunction off the charts. No credit available in a community with substantial transfer payment cash flow. Well, anyway, it was interesting to listen with that perspective over the next couple days to the comments people made. And one of the comments that really struck me was a very impressive younger man who grew up on the reservation but had been schooled partly off of it, was now working off the reservation, had developed some of the skills of conventional success. And he, in the second day, as people began to let down and get beyond the formal agenda and more of their life experience and emotions came out, he started to talk about how he felt torn. He said, any time that anyone in one of our families or in our tribe would have surplus, your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, your neighbors would come to you. Because the tradition of the tribe is that you're obligated to share what you have. Wealth is defined by what you can give, not what you can get. He said, but if you give to them, there's no opportunity for the kind of capital formation that allows for business development, as they're teaching me to build businesses in my school programs off the reservation. He said, what do we do? How do we balance these tensions and these responsibilities? And I think for me it was a very interesting set of comments that he made. When I was in Kenya some years later, in the squatter settlements, and you ask people, where do you live? And they don't name the squatter settlement where they do in fact reside today, but they name a village that they came from. And they'll bankrupt themselves to get a body back to that village to bury when the time comes, because they can't imagine being anywhere except in that village. That's their identity. So you look at those kind of traditional relationships that allowed an entire people and a culture to survive for longer than we can imagine. And then you see the children who've never known anything except that squatter settlement. Are they going to name the village? Do they have any place to claim? And you wonder, what will this mean? And I thought about the slums of Chicago, where I began to spend time after the civil rights movement turned my way of looking at my place in the world upside down. Because at the time I was a teenager, there were more black people from Mississippi in Chicago than there were black people left in Mississippi because of the Great Migration north, which to a large extent had been fueled by, Jim Crow and racial prejudice and the denial of opportunities. and what's interesting is that people came on that migration, and some found a place in the northern economy, but many never did. They never found a sustainable opportunity in the place where they landed. They're no longer the old people who still knew who they were and where they came from, but the kids did not. They weren't rural people, but they weren't urban people either, in the sense of having found an adequate replacement. Neither urban nor rural, what does community mean to them? And you can see the kinds of problems that were developing in those communities. And as I looked at the squatter settlement in Kenya, I said to myself, this is the same migration 20 years later. 10 years, 20 years from now, what will this look like? And you can already see it. It's moving even faster as these relationships break down. But, it's going back into the traditional lives that people led for generations. How we understood our relation to one another and our dependence on the earth. And we're not making a very good adaptation, either in our relationships to one another or in our understanding of labor. We've changed the meaning of work in a way that I think fundamentally undermines the ability of an economy to sustain a community. Because we've taken the immediacy of that relationship, the simple skills, and the production of basic goods out of the equation. And if you remove those things, what are you left with? It's not just Enron, but you're left with having transformed a working class into a petty investor class, which is terribly vulnerable. And that's the vulnerability of independent asset formation as a theory of community development. Is there no room for personal initiative or assets? Of course there's room. But to build an economy on individual assets in that sense alone, especially if assets have no relationship to productivity and to labor, is to build a house of cards that's going to collapse.
And that's also why the tribes think about community assets in terms of how do you mobilize capital? It's not through the individual accounts, it's through the investment in the tribal assets, whether those are schools or cultural centers, or something that everyone participates in and owns in a sense that's more consistent with the traditional culture.
And it's why so many people, the experiences that I had in Africa were so gratifying, though limited, and people were so gracious, in part because over and again they responded to my saying, I want you to know that I have not come here to bring you something which is new. I've come here to tell you what we're trying to do with what you've taught us. And that's not the message that they hear from conventional practitioners. Likewise, a couple of years ago I was invited to give the keynote talk at a national conference of community land trusts. And I chose to talk about my elders and the importance of an individual having a history, and a movement having a history, a community having a history. And my concern that this little community land trust movement that's emerging and in some ways beginning to thrive in this country is in danger of losing its history, or in some cases doesn't even know its history. In fact, if you trace the history of the community land trust model in this country, you'll find that its roots are in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and in the Gandhian tradition which informed that movement, and in other roots before those. But most of the advocates, the organizers even, don't know that. Ironically, they're going into African American communities introducing a model without being able to present a history that links that model so directly to the people of this community. Well, I was talking about our need as a movement to reclaim our history, to learn it, to celebrate it, and to pass it on. And when I was finished, two men came to me. They were middle-aged to older Chicano men. And they said, this was so exciting. No one has talked to me about land trust like this. I'm on the board of the Sawmill Community Land Trust, which is the local sponsor for this conference. But this makes me feel like I was when I was a teenager. And I said to them, were you with Tia Rena and Tia Maria in the 1960s when the manifestation of the civil rights movement in the Chicano community was a struggle over land rights? And they said, yeah, of course we were there. But we didn't know there was a relationship to who we were then and what we're doing now. They're both important to us, but you're the first person to help us understand that these tie together. And that's what we need. That's my concern now, that as we've grown and expanded and professionalized, we're very capable. And we're doing some marvelous things. And the Sawmill Land Trust is an exemplary and exciting organization, which is starting with a level of resources and skills, opportunities, with a scale of development that none of the early groups even had a chance or imagination to aspire to. But if we don't have that history, and if we don't create a culture that sustains these values over time, none of these endeavors, no matter how impressive they seem to be, will survive. Because fundamentally, we're still asking people to swim against some very powerful cultural and social currents. We live in what somebody has called, the age of the new religion of the marketplace. It's as if the market has defined reality. It's a divinely ordained institution. Well, that's not the way it was, and that's not the way it is. But it's the way it'll be if we don't, maintain, keep our history and shape a culture around it. Because it does, the things we're doing do ask people to make what at least appear to be sacrifices, and are sacrifices for the individual in the moment. There is a kind of second-class ownership if you look only at the individual disconnected from time and place and the community of which they're a part. So why would you do it? People make sacrifices out of gratitude for the fact that our ancestors sacrificed to give us what we have, and out of a commitment to passing this along to the next generation. That's why we do it. And to do that, you have to have a sense of time and a sense of your place in a continuum of human life and effort. And I think that's the understanding that has to ground community development or economic theory, though I don't know it would qualify in anybody else's definition as an economic theory. But if we lose that sense of time and place in our relationship to one another, nothing else will survive, including, I think, the most sophisticated and apparently successful economy.
That's what I mean, like putting the community back in community economic development.
Yeah. You know, when we were involved with you and others in organizing that New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and then a Boston Community Loan Fund, and another one here and another one there, as we took an initial small body of experience and said, well, this could be replicated by many people in many places. At one point we were going to publish a little newsletter that talked about these mushrooms sprouting here and there around the country. Little ones, but it was still exciting to see them sprout. And Kirby White, I think it was, who was going to write a little editorial for the cover of that newsletter. And the question that he was trying to address is, what is community economic development? And I remember his saying, or our together in conversations, the group of us coming up with a simple, statement that community economic development is a commitment to places, to specific places, and to the people who live in those places, and to our place in those places, and our relationship to our neighbors. So it's a commitment to place, but it's also a commitment to people, and first and foremost, those whose needs are greatest. It turns the conventional priorities on their head. The most important person is the person next to you in greatest need. And it's third, a commitment to projects, but the kinds of projects that strike that balance between the individual and the community, that recognize the fundamental relationship between the two and nurture that relationship. They're not projects that are collective simply. It's not simply another government program. Neither are they private in singular terms, but they're projects that reflect that relationship between the individual and his or her community. So it was a commitment to place and to people and to the kinds of projects that respect those places, the people in the places, the relationships between them, and acknowledge the primacy, the priority that should be given to those in greatest need. And that's what community economic development has to be. It's not simply another successful business.
Drink water.
Sure. There's ice in the fridge too, in the trays, and also